They say trust is the foundation of any marriage. For the longest time, I believed that to be true. For the past 12 years, Laura and I had built a life together that others envied. 3 beautiful children, a home in the suburbs with a lush lawn and a white picket fence, and a steady, thriving business I had grown from the ground up. Everything was perfect until the little thing started gnawing at me. It began subtly, the way betrayal often does. A misplaced glance, an awkward smile, a vague answer to an innocent question. At first, I dismissed it as stress. Laura had been acting unusually tense for weeks, her temper fraying at the edges. She'd snap at me over the smallest things, an unwashed dish, a missed text, a wrong word. It wasn't like her. Laura was usually poised, always in control. Then there were the objects. The first was a pair of handcuffs I found in the laundry. I had just come home from a long day at the office, my mind still buzzing with numbers and contracts, when I decided to help fold the clothes. Among the neatly sorted piles of shirts and socks, there they were, shiny, steel, and unmistakably real. They weren't the cheap, fuzzy kind couples buy as a joke. These were regulation, heavy-duty cuffs, the kind you'd see a cop slap onto a suspect on a crime show. I held them up, confused, wondering if they belonged to one of the kids. Maybe Sam, my oldest, had borrowed them for some school project. But no, these were too adult, too serious. Laura walked in at that moment, carrying a basket of freshly dried towels. "What's this?" I asked, dangling the cuffs in front of me. Her reaction was immediate. Her face flushed crimson, her eyes darting toward the handcuffs as though they might leap out of my grasp and incriminate her. But then, in a split second, her expression softened, replaced by that familiar mask of composure. "Oh, those," she laughed nervously. "They're a gag gift from Karen. You know how she is? Always buying the most ridiculous things." It didn't sit right with me. Karen wasn't the type to buy gag gifts. She was practical to a fault. Still, I let it go. What else was I supposed to do? Interrogate my wife over something so small? Then came the donut. A few weeks later, I found it sitting on the passenger seat of Laura's car. I wasn't snooping, not intentionally anyway. I'd been searching for her sunglasses, which she always seemed to misplace. When I opened the door, the sweet, sticky aroma hit me. It wasn't just any donut, either. It was from Jolly's, a local diner known for serving coffee and pastries exclusively to cops and first responders. There was no reason for Laura to be stopping at Jolly's. She hated donuts, despised the way sugar clung to her teeth. I knew this because she had scolded me for bringing donuts home for the kids just a week earlier. I asked her about it casually that evening, over dinner. "Did you stop by Jolly's today?" She froze for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. She laughed a little too loudly. "Why would I go there? You know I don't eat that junk." I didn't push. Instead, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe someone else had left it in her car. Maybe she wasn't lying. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But the knot in my stomach tightened. Over the next few weeks, the signs multiplied. Laura started spending more time on her phone, angling the screen away from me whenever I entered the room. She began working late, which was strange because she had always prioritized family dinners. Her explanations grew flimsier, her excuses thinner. Once, I came home early to surprise her and found the house empty. When she finally returned, an hour later, her hair was damp and she smelled faintly of soap. Too clean for someone who was supposed to have been running errands all afternoon. "What took so long?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Traffic," she said, barely meeting my eyes. Little by little, suspicion crept into my thoughts, uninvited and unwelcome. I hated myself for doubting her. This was Laura, my wife, the mother of my children. But the little inconsistencies, the half-truths, and the growing distance between us were impossible to ignore. I started watching her more closely, listening more carefully, looking for clues even when I didn't want to find them. And then came the call. It was late one evening when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Laura was upstairs putting the kids to bed, so I instinctively glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but the name Chris popped up in bold letters. No last name, just Chris. Something about it made my pulse quicken. I didn't answer, of course. I wasn't that kind of husband. But when Laura came downstairs a few minutes later and saw the missed call, her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She stared at the screen for a moment too long, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then she picked up the phone and deleted the notification without a word. "Who's Chris?" I asked, my voice casual. She looked up at me, startled, then laughed. "Oh, just someone from work. Nothing important." But her laugh sounded hollow, and the knot in my stomach tightened into a fist. Something was wrong. I could feel it, and deep down, I knew that whatever it was going to tear my world apart. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to convince myself that Laura was telling the truth. But the more I ignored it, the more the cracks in our life seemed to grow. It wasn't just her late nights or the strange excuses. It was the shift in how she looked at me. Her gaze, once warm and full of affection, now carried something colder. Guilt, maybe? Or resentment. It didn't take long for me to start digging. The first time I followed her was on a Thursday. Laura had claimed she needed to stay late at work for a meeting, something she'd never done before. "It's just a busy season," she'd explained, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she reached for her purse. "I'll be home by 10. I didn't believe her. So I waited until she pulled out of the driveway before grabbing my own keys and slipping into the car. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was the villain in some low-budget crime drama. But as I tailed her through the streets of our quiet town, I couldn't ignore the adrenaline surging through me. My heart raced, my palms slick against the steering wheel. Laura didn't go to her office. Instead, she drove to the far side of town, parking outside a nondescript brick building with darkened windows. A flickering neon sign above the door read Eagle's Nest Gym, a place I knew was frequented by cops and first responders. I watched as she stepped out of the car, her head swiveling nervously before slipping inside. I waited for nearly an hour, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, debating whether to go in. But what would I even say? What excuse could I give for being there? By the time Laura emerged, she looked flustered, her face flushed, her shirt slightly wrinkled. She didn't notice me as she climbed into her car and drove off. That night, I didn't confront her. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. Why had she lied? Who was she meeting at that gym? And why did it feel like my entire life was teetering on the edge of some invisible cliff? The next day, I made a decision. I would find out the truth. If Laura wouldn't tell me what was going on, I'd uncover it myself. I started with her phone. It took me 3 days to figure out her passcode. Laura wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but she was cautious. She kept her phone close, rarely leaving it unattended. On the rare occasions I got hold of it, I tried different combinations, birthdays, anniversaries, random guesses. Finally, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, while she was out shopping with the kids, I cracked it. 0704, the date of our wedding. The first thing I did was check her messages. Most of them were harmless, the usual back and forth with friends and coworkers. But then I found the texts from Chris. They were sparse, careful, as if the two of them were trying to avoid leaving a trail. Still, the messages were damning. Chris, same time this week? Eagle's Nest. Laura, yes, but not for long. He's getting suspicious. Chris, let me handle it. He won't be a problem. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The words felt like a knife, cutting deep, leaving me raw and bleeding. Let me handle it. He won't be a problem. What the hell did that mean? And who was this Chris to think he could handle me? I scrolled further, finding only fragments of their conversations, plans to meet, vague mentions of keeping things quiet, and once, a photo of Laura in a dress I'd never seen before. She was smiling, her head tilted just so, looking radiant. It wasn't meant for me. By the time Laura came home, I'd barely managed to pull myself together. She kissed me on the cheek, the way she always did, but it felt empty, robotic. As she busied herself unpacking groceries, I studied her, searching for any sign of remorse, any crack in the facade. But she was an expert at pretending. That night, as she slept beside me, I sat in the darkness, replaying those messages in my mind. Chris. The name had been nagging at me ever since it appeared on her phone. I knew it wasn't a coworker. Laura's office was a small team, and I'd met most of them at company parties. Then it hit me, the donut. Jollies. The connection was tenuous, almost laughable, but it was enough to set me down a path I wasn't prepared for. The next day, I drove to Jolly's Diner, hoping to find answers. The place was busy, filled with uniformed officers chatting over coffee and pastries. I took a seat at the counter, feeling out of place in my suit and tie. As I sipped my coffee, I listened to the conversations around me, tuning in whenever I heard the name Chris. It didn't take long to piece things together. Chris Adler, a sergeant with the local police force, divorced, no kids, known for being tough, even cruel, especially with civilians who got under his skin. My stomach churned as I realized the implications. Laura wasn't just lying to me. She was entangled with someone dangerous, someone who could make my life a living hell if he wanted to. And from the looks of it, he already did. That evening, I confronted her, softly, cautiously, testing the waters. "Do you know a Chris Adler?" I asked over dinner, keeping my tone light. Laura froze for a split second, her fork hovering in midair. Then she laughed, the sound forced and brittle. "Why would you ask that?" "I heard the name at Jolly's." I lied. Thought it sounded familiar. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know anyone by that name." Another lie. Another crack in the foundation. As I watched her resume eating, my appetite vanished. I knew, in that moment, that my marriage was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. There's a strange clarity that comes with betrayal. Once you've seen the cracks, you can't unsee them. They spread, widening with every glance, every word, every touch. I wanted to confront Laura outright, to demand the truth, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed more. Answers. Proof. A way to protect myself and my children from whatever storm was brewing. I started by digging into Chris Adler. It wasn't hard to find information on him. Public records, local news articles, even social media profiles. Chris wasn't shy about his presence. His Instagram was filled with pictures of himself in uniform, grinning beside his squad car, his arms crossed like he owned the world. There were photos of him at Jolly's Diner, his arms slung casually around a group of fellow officers. And then there were the darker posts, grainy, poorly lit images of suspects he'd arrested, often accompanied by captions dripping with arrogance. "Another scumbag off the streets. You're welcome, citizens." The more I learned about him, the more I understood why Laura might have fallen for someone like him. Chris was the opposite of me in every way, brash, impulsive, larger than life. Where I was steady and reliable, he was reckless and dangerous. Maybe that was the appeal. Maybe Laura had grown tired of stability, of predictability. Or maybe she just wanted someone who made her feel alive. But there was something else, something darker. The articles I found hinted at allegations of misconduct, excessive force, intimidation, abuse of authority. None of the complaints had stuck, of course. Cops like Chris were experts at covering their tracks. But the pattern was clear. He was a man who thrived on power and control. And now, he had a foothold in my life. A few days later, I decided to test the waters. If Chris Adler was as arrogant as he seemed, he wouldn't pass up an opportunity to flaunt his power. So, I drove to the Eagles' Nest gym. The place was quiet when I arrived, the parking lot half empty. I sat in my car watching the entrance, waiting. After 20 minutes, a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. Even from a distance, I recognized him. Chris. He didn't see me as he walked to his car, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. I waited until he pulled out of the lot before starting my engine and following him. It felt reckless, stupid even, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know where he was going, what he was doing. Chris drove across town, taking a winding route that made me wonder if he knew he was being followed. Finally, he pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel, the kind of place that reeked of secrecy. I parked a safe distance away, watching as he stepped out of the SUV and disappeared inside. For nearly an hour, I sat there, debating my next move. Was Laura in there with him? Was this their meeting place, their hideaway? The thought made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. Storming in would accomplish nothing, except maybe getting myself arrested. When Chris finally emerged, he wasn't alone. A man followed him out, thin and wiry, with a nervous energy that made him look like a rat scurrying from a trap. They spoke briefly before the man handed Chris a small envelope. Chris tucked it into his jacket, gave the man a hard clap on the shoulder, and walked away. What the hell was I watching? That night, I didn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was Chris dealing drugs? Laundering money? And how deep was Laura involved? Every time I thought I'd hit the bottom of this mess, the ground crumbled beneath me, revealing an even darker layer. The next morning, I called in a favor from an old friend, Greg, who worked as a private investigator. We'd gone to college together, and though we hadn't spoken in years, he agreed to meet me for lunch. "You look like hell," Greg said as he slid into the booth across from me. "Thanks," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "I feel worse." We talked over burgers and fries, and I laid everything out for him: the handcuffs, the text, the gym, Chris Adler. Greg listened quietly, his expression growing darker with each detail. "You're playing with fire, Nate," he said when I finished. "Adler's not the kind of guy you want to mess with." "I don't have a choice," I said. "He's already messing with me. I need to know what I'm up against." Greg sighed, leaning back in his seat. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up, but you need to be careful. Guys like Adler, they don't fight fair." Over the next week, Greg kept me updated. His findings only confirmed what I'd already suspected. Chris Adler was dirty, and he had a long history of making problems disappear. Witnesses recanted their statements. Complaints vanished from the record. And in at least one case, the complainant had mysteriously left town before the investigation could begin. "He's untouchable," Greg told me over the phone. "At least for now. But if he's involved with your wife," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. I hung up feeling sick. My marriage was unraveling, my life spinning out of control, and Chris Adler was at the center of it all. I thought I knew what I was getting into. I thought if I followed the clues long enough, pieced together the fragments, I'd find answers. Cold, hard facts I could confront Laura with. But the deeper I went, the more tangled it became. This wasn't just infidelity. It was something far worse, and it was slipping through my fingers like smoke. Greg called me late one night, his voice low and tense. "I've got something for you. Meet me tomorrow." Usual place. The usual place was a small coffee shop on the edge of town, quiet and unassuming. I arrived early, my nerves jangling, and sat at a corner table nursing a cup of black coffee. When Greg finally walked in, he looked grim, a man weighed down by what he knew. He slid into the seat across from me and pulled a folder from his bag. "You're not going to like this." I opened it and stared at the contents. Photos, financial records, police reports. The first photo hit me like a punch to the gut. Laura, standing close to Chris Adler outside the Eagles' Nest gym, her hand on his arm, her smile soft and intimate. Another photo showed them in his SUV, his hand on her thigh. But it wasn't just the photos. The financial records showed money flowing from Laura's personal account to an unmarked account that Greg had traced back to Adler. Small amounts at first, but they'd grown over time, hundreds then thousands. "Blackmail?" I asked, my voice tight. "Maybe," Greg said. "Or maybe it's something else. Adler's been under suspicion for extortion, among other things. He might have roped her into something she can't get out of." I flipped through the folder, my stomach sinking further with each page. The last report was the worst. A complaint filed by a local business owner, claiming Adler had threatened him over an unpaid debt. The details were chilling: vandalism, harassment, even threats against the man's family. The complaint had been dismissed, of course. Chris Adler was good at keeping his hands clean. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, shoving the folder away. "What is she doing?" Greg leaned forward, his expression serious. "I don't know, Nate, but you need to be careful. If Adler feels cornered, he'll come after you. And if Laura's in bed with him, figuratively or literally, she might not be on your side." The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to argue, to defend her, but deep down, I knew Greg was right. Laura wasn't the woman I thought she was, and Chris Adler wasn't just a threat to my marriage. He was a threat to my life. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I started by checking Laura's car. She'd left it in the driveway, and I knew she'd be at work for most of the day. My hands shook as I searched the glove compartment, the center console, the trunk. At first, I found nothing, just the usual clutter of receipts, pins, and loose change. But then, tucked beneath the spare tire in the trunk, I found it, a burner phone. The screen was cracked, the case scuffed, but it still worked. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the messages. Most were short, vague exchanges with a number saved as C. C. Tomorrow, same place. 8 p.m. Don't be late. Laura, I'll be there. He doesn't suspect anything. See, keep it that way. We're not done yet. The messages painted a picture I didn't want to see. Laura wasn't just cheating. She was hiding something. Something bigger than either of us. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight. My hands clammy. I shoved the phone back where I'd found it, slammed the trunk shut, and stumbled inside. My mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. I needed to confront her. When Laura came home that evening, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. The kids were upstairs, their laughter drifting down the hall. I'd poured myself a glass of whiskey, but I hadn't touched it. My hands were too unsteady. "Hey," she said, setting her purse on the counter. Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it, a tension I couldn't ignore. "You're home early." "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "I thought we should talk." She froze, her smile faltering. "About what?" I held her gaze, searching for a crack in her facade. "About you. About Chris Adler." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising. "I've seen the messages. I know about the money. I know you've been meeting him." Her expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "You've been spying on me?" "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "You're the one sneaking around with a dirty cop." "What the hell are you doing, Laura?" Her composure shattered. "You don't understand," she hissed, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me," I said, stepping closer. "Tell me what's going on, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months." Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were genuine. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Nate, please," she said, her voice breaking. "It's complicated. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Then why did it?" I demanded. "Why him? Why Adler?" Her answer was barely above a whisper. "Because I didn't have a choice." I stared at her, my mind racing to decipher the meaning behind those 7 words. My wife, the woman I had built a life with, the mother of my children, stood before me, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling at her sides. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to believe she was still the person I thought she was. But the lies had grown too thick, the cracks too deep. "You didn't have a choice?" I repeated, my voice cold. "What does that even mean, Laura? Start talking. Now!" Her lips quivered, and she looked away, as if she couldn't bear the weight of my gaze. "It's not what you think, Nate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Chris, he came to me months ago. He knew things about us." "What things?" I demanded. "What the hell are you talking about?" She hesitated, her hands wringing together nervously. "About your business," she finally said. "He said he had evidence, fraud, embezzlement, things that could ruin you." I blinked, stunned. "Fraud? Embezzlement? That's ridiculous. I've done everything by the book." "I know," she said quickly. "I know you'd never do anything illegal." But he didn't care. He said he could make it look real, make it stick. He said he'd destroy you if I didn't cooperate. The word hit me like a slap. Cooperate. A sanitized way of saying she'd given herself to him, betrayed me to protect me, or so she claimed. I shook my head, anger bubbling in my chest. "So, you just went along with it? You didn't think to come to me? To tell me what was going on?" "I was scared," she cried, her voice breaking. "He's a cop, Nate. A powerful one. What was I supposed to do? If I fought back, he'd ruin us. He'd ruin you. I couldn't let that happen." Her tears flowed freely now, but they did little to move me. I felt numb, detached, like I was watching this scene unfold from somewhere outside my body. "So what?" I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You thought sleeping with him was the solution?" "It wasn't like that," she sobbed. "At first I thought I could talk him out of it, make him see reason, but he wouldn't back down. And then he started asking for more money, favors me. My fists clenched at my sides, the anger boiling over. You're telling me you've been paying this guy off with my money? And when that wasn't enough, I couldn't even finish the sentence. The words were too vile, too painful. Laura dropped her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking. I didn't know what else to do. He said if I didn't give him what he wanted, he'd hurt you. Or the kids. I paced the kitchen, my mind a chaotic mess of rage, betrayal, and confusion. Her story reeked of half-truths and omissions. But even if there was some kernel of truth in it, I couldn't wrap my head around her choices. You should have told me, I said finally, my voice tight. We could have fought him together. You don't understand, she said, looking up at me with desperate eyes. Chris isn't just some cop. He's connected. He has people in his pocket. If we try to fight him, he'd bury us. I slammed my hand down on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. So instead, you decided to sneak around behind my back? To let him blackmail you? I broke off, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, her silence answering the question for her. How long, Laura? I demanded, my voice rising. 6 months, she whispered. It started 6 months ago. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of deception, of sharing my wife with a man who saw her as nothing more than a plaything. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me winded and reeling. Does he still have leverage over you? I asked, my tone sharp. What does he want now? She hesitated again, and I could see the gears turning in her mind, calculating how much to tell me. He wants more money, she said finally. He said the payments we've made so far aren't enough, and he's been getting impatient. Impatient. The word carried a sinister weight, and I felt a fresh wave of dread wash over me. Chris Adler wasn't just a threat to my marriage. He was a threat to my entire family. And Laura, whether out of fear or desperation, had handed him the keys to our lives. I stared at her, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to throw her out, to walk away from the mess she created. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not while Chris Adler was still out there, holding a knife to our throats. Where is he now? I asked. She looked at me, startled. What? You heard me, I said, my tone icy. Where is he? When's the next time you're supposed to meet him? Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. Nate, please don't do anything stupid. If you confront him, I don't care what he'll do, I interrupted. This ends now. Tell me when and where. She hesitated, her fear palpable. Tomorrow night, she said finally. At the gym? 8 o'clock. I nodded, my jaw clenched. Good. Then I'll handle it. That night, as Laura slept fitfully beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. I didn't have a plan. Not yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Chris Adler destroy my family. If he wanted a fight, I was ready to give him one. But deep down, a voice whispered that this wasn't going to end cleanly. Men like Adler didn't back down. And if I wasn't careful, I might lose more than just my marriage. The next day passed in a blur. I went through the motions at work, barely hearing my employees, my mind consumed by the storm that was about to unfold. Laura avoided me all morning, her guilt and fear etched into every nervous glance. I didn't press her. There was no point. I'd gotten what I needed from her, a time and a place. Now I just had to figure out how to use it. By the time evening rolled around, my resolve was steel. I couldn't let this drag on. Adler had wormed his way into my life, poisoned my marriage, and threatened my family. If Laura's story was even half true, he was a dangerous man, the kind who didn't hesitate to crush anyone in his way. But I wasn't going to let him crush me. I left the house around 7:30, telling Laura I was going to meet a friend for drinks. She didn't question me. Her eyes said she knew exactly where I was going. As I walked out the door, she grabbed my arm. Nate, she said, her voice trembling. Please don't do this. He'll ruin you. I stared at her for a moment, searching for the woman I thought I'd married. But all I saw was someone I barely recognized. Someone who had lied to me, betrayed me, and now begged me to let her lover off the hook. I'll take my chances, I said coldly, shaking her off. The drive to the Eagles' Nest gym felt surreal. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know exactly what I planned to do when I got there. A confrontation was inevitable. But what then? Adler wasn't just some thug I could scare off with threats. He was a cop with connections and power. If I made the wrong move, he could ruin me. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting him continue to hold my family hostage, wasn't an option. I parked down the street, far enough away that my car wouldn't draw attention, and walked toward the gym. The building loomed in the distance, its windows glowing faintly in the night. I glanced at my phone. 7:55. 5 minutes until their scheduled meeting. Adrenaline surged through me as I approached, every nerve on edge. The street was quiet, the air thick with the weight of what I was about to do. I slipped around the back of the building, searching for an angle, a way to observe without being seen. A service entrance caught my eye, its rusted door propped open slightly. I crept closer, peering inside. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with lockers and the faint smell of sweat and rubber mats. Voices echoed from somewhere deeper inside. 2 people, 1 male, 1 female. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. "Relax," Adler's voice drawled, oozing arrogance. "I told you, everything's under control." "I don't feel like it's under control," Laura snapped. Her voice was tight, angry. "He's suspicious. He's already asked about you." Adler chuckled. "Let him ask. What's he going to do? Call the cops on me?" "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "Nate's not stupid. He'll figure it out." "And then what?" Adler said, his tone turning cold. "You think he scares me? You think I can't handle him?" The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment I saw red. I wanted to storm in, to wipe that smug grin off his face, but I forced myself to stay still. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. "Look," Adler said, his voice softening. "You've done your part. Just stick with the plan a little longer, and we'll both get what we want." "What I want," Laura spat, "is for this to be over." "It will be," Adler said. "Soon. Trust me." I couldn't listen anymore. My fists clenched at my sides, my blood boiling as I stepped into the hallway. My footsteps echoed off the walls, drawing their attention. Adler turned first, his expression flickering with surprise before settling into a cocky smirk. Laura's face, on the other hand, went pale. Well, Adler said, leaning casually against a locker. "If it isn't the man of the hour." "Adler," I said, my voice low and steady. "We need to talk." He spread his arms, grinning. "By all means, talk." I glanced at Laura, who stood frozen, her eyes darting between us. "You can go," I told her. "This is between me and him." "Nate, don't," she began, but I cut her off with a sharp look. For once, she listened, backing away slowly before disappearing down the hall. Adler watched her go, then turned back to me, his smirk widening. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But coming here? Big mistake." "You think so?" I said, stepping closer. "I think it's time someone put you in your place." He laughed, a deep, mocking sound. "You really don't get it, do you? I could destroy you with one phone call. Your business, your reputation, your family gone. You're nothing compared to me." "Is that so?" I said, my voice calm despite the fire raging inside me. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a sad, pathetic little man who gets off on terrorizing people." The smirk disappeared, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Careful," he said, his tone low and threatening. "You don't want to push me." "Or what?" I said, stepping closer until we were inches apart. "You'll frame me? Blackmail me? Sleep with my wife again?" His fist shot out, slamming into the locker beside my head. The sound echoed through the hallway, but I didn't flinch. If anything, it only fueled my anger. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled. "Neither do you," I shot back. For a moment we stood there, locked in a battle of wills. Then he stepped back, his smirk returning. "You got balls, I'll give you that. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the empty hallway. As I drove home that night, my mind raced with everything that had just happened. Adler wasn't bluffing. He was dangerous, and now I'd painted a target on my back. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The storm was just beginning, and I had no choice but to ride it out. The morning after my confrontation with Chris Adler, I woke up feeling drained but resolute. The lines had been drawn, and I was ready to fight for my family, even if I wasn't sure whether Laura deserved to be part of that family anymore. The confrontation had been a gamble, and I knew Adler wouldn't let it go unanswered. Still, I told myself I'd crossed a necessary line. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on. But life, as I'd come to learn, has a way of hitting you hardest when you think you've seen it all. That Friday, I was packing for a weekend trip to the mountains with a few old friends. It had been planned for months, a rare opportunity to escape the chaos of daily life and unwind in the quiet of nature. Now, it felt like a much-needed distraction from the wreckage of my marriage. Laura barely acknowledged me as I gathered my gear. Her guilt and fear were etched into every nervous glance. She'd been walking on eggshells since my confrontation with Adler, avoiding me whenever possible. I threw the last of my things into the trunk and was about to pull out of the driveway when I realized I'd grabbed the wrong sleeping bag. The one in my car was old and thin, useless against the chill of the mountains. With a sigh, I turned the car off and headed back inside to grab the newer one from the garage. I opened the door to the garage, my mind already on the trip ahead. But as I stepped inside, I stopped in my tracks. What I saw didn't immediately register. It was too surreal, too wrong. Laura was there, sitting on the floor near the far wall, her wrists locked in a pair of steel handcuffs secured to a pipe. Her face was pale, her expression caught between anger and fear. Standing beside her, casually leaning against my workbench, was Chris Adler. He wasn't in uniform, dressed in a casual shirt and jeans, but his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. He had a smirk on his face, one that sent a surge of heat up my spine. In his hand was something as absurd as it was infuriating, a half-eaten donut. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Well, look who decided to join us," Adler said finally, his tone dripping with mockery. Perfect timing. Laura opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Her eyes darted between me and Adler, panic written all over her face. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. Adler straightened, taking another bite of the donut. "Relax," he said, his tone maddeningly calm. "Just a friendly visit. Thought I'd have a little chat with Laura here." "A chat," I repeated, the anger bubbling up in my chest. "This is my house, my family. You don't just get to show up and do this." Adler shrugged, his smirk widening. "Your house, sure. But Laura and I, well, we got unfinished business, don't we?" I took a step forward, my fists clenched at my sides. "Get out. Now." Adler didn't move. If anything, he seemed amused. "Careful, Nate," he said, his tone shifting to something colder. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." "Worse?" I snapped. "You've already crossed every line. You've threatened my family, invaded my home. What more could you possibly do?" Adler's grin faded, his expression turning dark. "A lot more than you think." The way he said it, so calm and confident, sent a chill down my spine. But I didn't back down. I couldn't. This was my home, my family, and I wasn't about to let this man take that from me. "You've got two choices," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Leave now and never come back, or I call the cops and make sure you answer for every single thing you've done." Adler laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Call the cops? On me? Good luck with that." He set the donut down on the workbench and took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're the hero in all this, don't you? The good guy? Hate to break it to you, but your perfect little life isn't so perfect anymore." I wanted to hit him. My whole body burned with the urge to knock that smug look off his face. But I knew that's exactly what he wanted, to provoke me, to make me lose control. And if I gave in, he'd win. Instead, I stood my ground. "You don't scare me," I said quietly. "You never have." For a moment, Adler said nothing. Then, he took a step back, grabbing his jacket from the workbench. "This isn't over, Nate," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not by a long shot." He turned and walked out of the garage, his footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't move until I heard the sound of his car, starting and fading into the distance. Laura's sobs broke through the haze, pulling me back to the present. I grabbed the keys hanging by the door and unlocked the cuffs, freeing her wrists. She pulled her hands to her chest, her body shaking with silent tears. "I didn't know he was coming," she said, her voice trembling. "He just showed up. I didn't know what to do." I stared at her, my emotions warring between anger, pity, and exhaustion. "You could have told me," I said finally. "You could have warned me." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't think it would come to this." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was too full of questions, too full of doubts. Without another word, I grabbed the sleeping bag and walked out, leaving her sitting on the floor. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Adler's parting words weren't just a threat. They were a promise. And somehow, I knew the worst was still ahead. I spent the next few days in a haze of anger and disbelief. Adler's words echoed in my mind, each one a fresh wound. "Your perfect little life isn't so perfect anymore." He'd said it with such smug certainty, as if he knew something I didn't. And that thought, that there was more to this nightmare than I already knew, gnawed at me like a splinter buried deep under my skin. Laura tried to talk to me, but I avoided her. I wasn't ready to hear more lies or excuses. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal, the months of deceit. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about Adler's parting words. They haunted me, twisting and turning in my mind until I couldn't ignore them anymore. On the fourth day, I made a decision. It wasn't an easy one, but it felt like the only way to regain some semblance of control. If Adler had meant what I thought he did, I needed to know. I needed the truth, even if it destroyed me. I took my youngest, Emily, out for ice cream that afternoon. She was 6, full of energy and joy, her laughter like a balm on my frayed nerves. As we sat at the picnic table outside the shop, watching the sun dip low in the sky, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small plastic tube. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Can I ask you for a little favor?" She looked up at me, her face smeared with chocolate. "What kind of favor?" "It's just a fun little test," I said, holding up the tube. "I need you to spit in this for me." Her nose wrinkled. "Spit?" "Just a tiny bit," I said, smiling. "It's for science." She giggled and took the tube from my hand, spitting into it with gusto. I capped it quickly, my stomach churning with guilt. "Thanks, kiddo," I said, ruffling her hair. "You're the best." She beamed at me, her eyes sparkling with trust and love. And for a moment, I felt like the worst person in the world. The test results arrived a week later. I'd opted for the rush service, unable to bear the thought of waiting any longer. When the email came through, my hands trembled as I clicked it open. The report was clinical, full of percentages and technical terms, but the conclusion was clear. Emily wasn't my biological daughter. I stared at the words, my vision blurring, my chest tightening like a vice. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping, suffocating under the weight of what I'd just learned. Emily, the little girl who'd curled up in my lap to watch cartoons, who'd given me handmade Father's Day cards with crooked hearts and stick figures, wasn't mine. She was Adler's. I sank into a chair, the phone slipping from my hand. The betrayal felt endless, like a bottomless pit I'd been thrown into, with no way to climb out. Laura hadn't just lied to me, hadn't just cheated on me. She'd built a life with me on a foundation of deceit. And now, everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, was crumbling around me. When Laura walked into the room later that evening, she froze at the sight of me. I must have looked like a ghost, pale and hollow, the test results still open on my laptop. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice wary. I looked up at her, my jaw tight. "I know." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "Know what?" "Emily," I said, my voice cracking. "She's not mine." She didn't respond, but the way her shoulders slumped told me everything I needed to know. The guilt in her eyes, the way she couldn't meet my gaze, it was all there, written across her face. "How long have you known?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Did you know from the start? Or did you figure it out later and decide to keep it a secret?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she took a step toward me. "Nate, please." "Don't." I said sharply, holding up a hand. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I want the truth, Laura. All of it. Right now. She sank into the chair across from me, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I didn't know at first, she said quietly. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought she was yours. I swear I did. But after she was born, I started having doubts. Doubts? I spat. That's all you had? Doubts? And you didn't think I deserved to know? I didn't want to lose you, she said, her voice breaking. You're her father, Nate. In every way that matters. You've been there for her, loved her, raised her. That's what's important. No, I said, shaking my head. What's important is that you lied to me. You lied to me about everything. Her tears spilled over, and she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Nate, please, she whispered. Don't do this. Don't let this tear us apart. I stood, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides. You did that all on your own. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at a framed photo of our family. Emily's smile beamed back at me. So innocent, so full of joy. She didn't know any of this. She didn't know the man she called Daddy wasn't really her father. And as much as I hated Laura, as much as I wanted to walk away from this mess, I couldn't bring myself to hate Emily. She was innocent in all of this, a victim of Laura's lies just like me. But knowing she wasn't mine didn't change the way I felt about her. She was still my little girl, and no DNA test could take that away. The days that followed the DNA test were some of the hardest of my life. The weight of betrayal sat heavy on my chest, making it hard to breathe, let alone think clearly. Laura tried to talk to me, to explain, but I couldn't stand to be near her. Her words, apologies, excuses, pleas for forgiveness, were just noise like static in the background of a life I no longer recognized. I stayed because of the kids. Emily didn't know anything, and I wanted to keep it that way. She was still my little girl, still the one who hugged me when I came home from work, who asked me to check for monsters under her bed. And Sam and Lily, the older ones, needed stability, even if I felt like I was barely holding myself together. For them, I pretended everything was fine, even though my world had been turned upside down. Laura and I slept in separate rooms, the distance between us a reflection of the chasm her lies had created. At night, I lay awake, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Could I forgive her? Should I? Was it even possible to rebuild what she had destroyed? And then there was Adler. He hadn't made good on his threats yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. Every time the phone rang or a car pulled up outside, I braced myself, expecting him to strike. I felt like a man standing in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the storm to crash down around me. One evening, as I sat in my office with a glass of whiskey, staring at the family photo on my desk, Laura walked in. She looked hesitant, as though she wasn't sure whether I'd throw her out or listen. I didn't say anything, just gestured for her to speak. I know you hate me, she said softly, her voice trembling. And I know I deserve it. But we need to talk about what happens next. I set my glass down and leaned back in my chair, studying her. What do you mean? Adler, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's not going to stop, Nate. He wants control. He always has. And as long as we're divided, he thinks he can use that against us. I wanted to argue, to tell her that this was her fault, that she'd handed him the power he now held over us. But she was right. Adler wasn't just a threat to me. He was a threat to all of us. And if we didn't find a way to fight back, he would destroy everything. What do you suggest? I asked finally. She hesitated, as if she couldn't quite believe I was willing to listen. We need to take away his leverage. If we go to the police. The police? I cut her off, incredulous. He is the police, Laura. You think his buddies are going to investigate him, let alone take him down? There are people who can help, she said, her voice firm. Internal affairs journalists, someone. If we don't do something, he's going to keep coming after us. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I hated the idea of working with her, of pretending we were still a team, but I couldn't ignore the reality of our situation. Adler was a threat, and as much as I hated to admit it, we were stronger together. Over the next few weeks, we started building a case against Adler. It wasn't easy. Laura's messages with him were careful, vague, leaving little room for concrete evidence. But Greg, my private investigator friend, proved invaluable. He dug into Adler's past, uncovering a trail of misconduct and corruption that stretched back years. Bribes, intimidation, even ties to organized crime. It was all there, hidden in the cracks of his spotless record. We worked in secret, meeting in coffee shops and parking lots, always looking over our shoulders. Adler hadn't made contact since our confrontation in the garage, but I knew he was watching. I could feel his presence, like a shadow that never left. When we finally had enough evidence, Greg helped us connect with a reporter at a major newspaper. The journalist, a seasoned investigator named Evelyn, was eager to take on the story. She promised to expose Adler, to bring his crimes to light in a way he couldn't silence. The article hit the front page a month later. Corruption in the ranks, a police sergeant's hidden crimes. Adler's name and face were plastered across every news channel and website in the region. The fallout was immediate. An internal investigation was launched, and Adler was suspended pending the outcome. His allies within the department distanced themselves, and the shield of invincibility he'd worn for so long began to crack. It wasn't the end, not yet. Adler was still out there, still dangerous. But for the first time, I felt like we had a fighting chance. As the dust began to settle, I turned my attention to my family. Laura and I were still fractured, the wounds between us far from healed. But there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild. Not for her sake, but for the kids. Emily, Sam, and Lily deserved stability, a life free from fear and betrayal. One evening, as I sat with Emily reading her favorite book, she looked up at me and smiled. "I love you, Daddy." The words hit me harder than I expected, filling me with a bittersweet ache. She didn't know the truth, and maybe she never would. To her, I was still her father, still the man she trusted and loved. And in that moment, I realized that was enough. I wasn't sure what the future held for Laura and me, whether we could find a way back to each other, or if this was the beginning of the end. But one thing was certain, no matter what, I would always fight for my children. They were my anchor, my reason to keep going, even in the darkest of times. Adler had tried to tear my life apart, but he hadn't won. And as long as I had my family, even in its broken, imperfect state, I knew I could weather any storm.